Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone and welcome to another week of Cash Plays. I am Bart Hanson. Today's episode, September 3rd, Reversed Implied Odds. As always, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com. You can leave a voicemail over at 877-836-ROAD. Man, I just have not been getting voicemails. I'm very disappointed in you guys. You can Skype me at bart.hanson, and you can leave a voicemail over at Skype at 323-743-8404. Now, I'm still testing my Skype connection. People are like, wow, how the hell would it take you 4 weeks to try to test your Skype connection? But I'm trying to get the best quality on here so that I can start doing Skype interviews. I'm trying to test my wireless versus hardline. And I thought one of the good ways to try to test this was, if you're interested in possibly taking a random Skype from me and you have maybe a question for me that you can think of, just shoot me over a line this week, and over in the next few days I will be kind of Skyping people that say that they want to be Skyped because I want to record it. And maybe I'll use one on next week's show. I'm going to do 3 or 4 just to kind of tweak the audio, and if it's good enough, we'll definitely use it on a future show. And the idea is that, again, kind of like a live phone call thing, where maybe I think a more practical way to do the phone call thing is if people email questions that they want to talk about on Skype, and then I pick the best questions out and I contact them, and then record a little, like 4 or 5 minutes, and we put it on the show. And, basically a phone call, not necessarily live, but I think that that's the best way to go about doing it. So you can look for that stuff. Now, this week's episode, Reversed Implied Odds. Interesting. The reason why I titled the episode Reversed Implied Odds is because I got crushed in a hand where I had pretty good reversed implied odds. Playing 10-25 at the bike. And, it's not the best example. I'll get to the hand in a couple minutes. I was kind of floating, and then I hit my very weak draw, and it was no good. But that's, basically why I wanted to talk about reverse implied odds, because I think it's a very important concept in No Limit Hold'em. Now, I dusted off my old copy of The Theory of Poker by Skalansky, and I looked at the definition of reverse implied odds. And the definition, as written, is reverse implied odds are the ratio of the amount of money now in the pot to the amount of money you'll have to call to continue from the present round to the end of the hand. Now, technically, that is the definition of reversed implied odds, because, we're talking about odds as opposed to implied odds, where implied odds, you make a call with the intention of making more money down the line. Reverse implied odds talks about you making a call and losing the hand down the line, how much money that's going to cost you. Now, his example, though, that he uses is pretty poor, I think, and I think screw Skalansky on this particular one in his discussion of reverse implied odds. Because he talks about flopping a hand where you think that you're good, but it will cost you a lot to continue on with the hand. Say the board comes out, 7-3-3, and you've got pocket fours, and a pre-flop raiser makes a continuation bet, and you call thinking you're good. And you think to yourself, well, I'm going to call all the way down here because this guy's a bluffer. Well, the issue that Skalansky brings up is that you'll probably win the minimum because he normally is going to shut down on future streets unless he has you beat, and you're going to lose the maximum later on. Which I guess is an example, but I think a more practical example of reverse implied odds, and it's about, you see it on a lot of websites and stuff when you look up the term, is the amount of money lost when drawing the hands that when are made, or that when the draw comes in, is not the best hand. Now, the easiest example of this are small flush draws. So, you flop a flush draw, you flop an 8 high flush draw on a 2 flush board, and you're not that deep, or you're playing, a low level, and the flush comes in, and you lose, or you get stacked off to a higher flush, well, that is a perfect example of reversed implied odds. And you've got to be careful when you're drawing the small flushes. And then, there are different examples. Say you're playing a 5-10 no limit game, and, the board comes out with a 2 suit, and you've got, kind of a dryish 8 high flush. Pre-flop raiser bets, a guy in the middle calls, and you overcall. Now the flush comes in, the pre-flop raiser checks, the guy in the middle bets, you call, and then the river's a blank, and now the guy in the middle, say he bet pot on turn and on the river. There's a very good chance that you're not good there. And again, that represents the idea of reversed implied odds. Flush draws are interesting because they're so obvious that sometimes, you definitely have to increase your implied odds with flush draws because the draws are so obvious. It's the most obvious draw that comes in. And I don't know if I've talked about this on the show before, if there is the presence of multiple players in the hand, you have to increase the amount of money you think you're going to make in the hand, or you think you need to make in the hand because of reversed implied odds. So if you're calling 20, you think to yourself, well, I need to make, X amount of money in the hand. I need to make 8 times this amount. Well, you might need to make more than that because, again, the chance that somebody else, if the draw comes in, has you beaten. And, that might be a little bit confusing where people are like, well, what do you mean? If the guy's got you beat, aren't you going to lose? Yes, you're going to lose, but when you're deciding to go for that draw, it kind of, by telling yourself that you actually need to make, 300 instead of maybe what the correct implied odds would be, which is 200. You now look at these guys' stack sizes and you say, these guys don't have enough money to go for this, or they might normally have just enough money to go for this draw, but I'm going to fold this hand because the chances that I get paid off, coupled with the fact that I actually might lose my stack, makes it a fold. So you have to, combine all of those different elements when you are trying to figure out if you're going to go for a draw or not. Another example of, draw that gives you some reverse implied odds are gut shots to, not the nuts. And you got to watch out for these gut shots. Now, most people are smart enough to not go for these, but the most glaring of examples are when your gut shot brings in a straight that's open-ended on the flop. And I'll give you an example. Queen 9-7 board, you've got 6-10, turns an 8, and you make your straight. Now a guy who's got Jack 10 has the nuts, and you lose with 10-6. And I talked about this on the earlier episode. You don't really want to be going for gut shots that aren't the nuts. But here's another example that comes up when you think that you've got a fairly good draw. Be wary of up and down to open-ended straight draws when the top end comes in. Up and down meaning up and down meaning that you've got a 2-gap card and the middle cards come in on the board. So say you've got 9-6 and the board comes out 7-8 deuce. So you're open-ended. You've got up and down. All right. Bottom end comes in, a 5 comes in. Okay, you got the nuts. Now the board's 7-8 5 deuce. You've got the nuts. You've got 9-6. However, if the top end comes in, a 10, if someone is peeling for a gut shot to the nuts, like Jack 9, then you're beat. And again, you've got to kind of be wary of, multiple overcallers, on a rainbow board, 7-8 deuce, you bet or a guy bets, you call, and a couple other people call. Now the turn's a 10. Be a little bit wary of that, especially in deeper stack games. Now, again, the reason why I did this episode was because I had a hand at the bike where I lost basically my stack, $3,000, and this went down. I called an open raise from a semi-solid player, in the cutoff. He was one to my right with 7-4 of clubs. He's a little bit weak tight, and I think he tends to pay off a little bit. So with those combinations, I figured I had 3,000 effective. He had me covered. I figured getting about 30 to 1 on the raise size, it was enough. If I was playing purely to hit my hand, it's close. 30 times with a double gap suited connector, it's close. But I thought, I can outplay this guy in position. Other things going for me. Position being the biggest one. So I call the 100, the guy in the blind calls. So now the pot's 300. Again, 10 and a quarter, effective stacks 3,000. The flop comes out king, 8, 7, 2 spades, 1 club. King of clubs, 8 of spades, 7 of spades. The guy who's the pre-flop, the blind checks, the guy who's the pre-flop raiser bets 175. I just didn't think that he was all that strong. I thought that there was even a chance that he might not have a king. I thought maybe he was betting with queens, jacks, or tens. The board is extremely drawy, so I know if some sort of draw comes in on the turn and he doesn't have a king, he's just going to give up. If he doesn't have a king, and even if it's a blank comes on the turn and he checks me and I bet, he might just give up. I thought it was a perfect spot for me to float. Again, if he's got ace-king or if he's got aces, he's the type of player that would fold to the obvious draw. So I thought it was a pretty good spot for me to do kind of a semi-float. I've got bottom pair and a backdoor club draw. The guy in the blind folds. So now the pot's $650. Turns a 4. Remember, I've got 7-4 of clubs in my hand. So now I have bottom 2 pair, king, 8, 7, 4. Pot 650. Now he comes out and bets 500. Well, obviously now I know he has a real hand. He has to have at least ace-king, maybe king-queen, at least a king, where he thinks that he is betting, kind of try to protect against a draw. So it kind of puts me in an interesting quandary with my stack. I started the hand with 3,000, called the 100, called the 175. I've got about 27, 25 left. He bets 500 into 650. The pot's 1150. When I call the 500, now the pot's 1650. And now I've got 22, 25 left in my stack. So if I make the call, I've got just over a pot size bet left. Now, obviously, I'm not going to call there. I'm thinking to myself, but I was trying to figure out how to extract the most money. So I did it in my head. I said, if I shove, what are the odds that this guy is going to get? Well, again, 1650 plus 22 and a quarter, 38.75 would be the total pot size. 22 and a quarter for him to call. Because remember, I had 27.25 when he bet on the turn. So plus, the 1150 that's in there, 38 and a quarter, 22 and a quarter to call, something like that. So I'm thinking, I've played this hand like I've got some sort of big draw, backdoor draw. And again, he's a fairly good player. Normally I'm going to raise that flop with a 1 pair plus hand. I just thought that I made it look like I've picked up, maybe I had a draw, now I've got a pair and a straight draw, flush draw, or, pair, straight draw, just some sort of combo draw. When I made that shove, I really thought that the line that I'm taking looks like a combo draw, and it's not that much more for the guy to call. He's getting almost 2 to 1, and I thought that he'd call with an overpair. So I thought the best play for me was to shove there. Well, he snap calls. I was like, uh-oh. And he's got a set of kings. So, obviously I had the wrong idea. The float wasn't really going to work. Even if a spade had come, he's probably going to take one off. And I think he even had he had the king of spades. So, the flop was king 8-7 with the king of clubs. So if a spade comes, he's got the king of spades with the top set. And obviously, huge reverse implied odds if I hit my weak draw. And again, I wasn't playing the hand for the strength of a draw, but I was, playing my position, but I had that backdoor out of the 2-pair or trips, and when I hit it, it was no good. And I got crushed. So that was a little bit of discussion of reversed implied odds. And again, the most important thing being that if you think it's close in terms of your implied odds, if you think it's a very close call, whether you are supposed to continue on with the hand because you're not 100% sure if you have the implied odds, factor in reversed implied odds. And sometimes that means that it's a fold, especially if there's multi-way action. Moving along here, PLO tip of the day. And I've been playing, again, more and more PLO. I actually posted a hand up on, I think, 2+2, basically talking about a hand where I had double suited kings and I flopped the second nut flush draw with a gut shot, and a guy bet and then another guy raised, and I knew that my range of hand was just killed if I was against the nut flush draw and aces, and I probably should have folded, but I called because I'm actually making some calls at this level that I know aren't correct, just kind of to see, almost like as an experimental thing. And somebody actually posted that I really should be playing 50 cent a dollar or 1-2 if I really want to learn the game. And that's probably a good idea. I mean, the money means nothing. It's just an issue of starting from the bottom and putting out enough hands. But I can kind of tell that, the play is weak. It's just I probably can learn a lot more, as I move up. So I'm actually going to move up here to 50 cent a dollar or 1-2. But the PLO tip of the day, betting less than the pot. One of the reasons why PLO plays bigger than no limit at the same stakes is because everyone's compelled to bet pot, whereas in no limit, people bet half pot and they massage the pot more. So, kind of like what I did in an earlier episode about why are you betting, ask yourself, why am I betting the pot? And this is something, again, that even at the lower levels I've seen. A lot of times you're betting the pot for value. People are going to call withdraws. You don't mind getting check raised when you've got, a monster dominating draw like top pair and a wrap, or, aces in the nut flush draw against a straight draw board with a flush board out there, and, you think the guy's got a wrap and a smaller flush draw. Well, you crush his range. You're betting pot sometimes as a bluff. And that goes hand in hand with to define your hand and not get bluffed. And what I've seen is that sometimes at the lower stakes, again, I can only speak to the lower stakes, and as I continue to get into more and more PLO as I move up, I'll talk about some of the differences in play. But when you bet less than pot, it sometimes induces raises, kind of mini-ish check raises. If you bet half pot on what seems like a drawy board, people seem to think, well, why is he only betting half pot? I'm going to make the minimum raise here, or I'm going to min raise him. So if you've got like a bear over pair and you've bet only half pot, sometimes you induce a bluff raise, where if you've bet full pot, the guy just folds. And the problem with Omaha as opposed to no limit is that it's very difficult to call a min raise there with one pair and no draw, because the turn card is always going to hurt your hand. It's never really going to improve your hand unless you make a set, or unless you already have a pair on the flop besides your over pair. So, that's why I've seen a lot of people, some of the reasons why I think that they bet pot. But the tip of the day is, why would you ever bet less than pot? Now, pre-flop raising, I think, especially if you're opening from late position, I really believe that you shouldn't always open for pot. I think that opening for half pot and opening for 3/4 pot gets kind of the same job done, and especially if, your opponent's aggressive, or if you find yourself relatively deep and you don't have the style of putting a ton of pressure on your opponents and you don't like to play big pots, it really helps you manage the size of the pot post flop. So, I'm kind of a big advocate of not necessarily raising full pot or opening for full pot in those spots. Now, after pre-flop, on the flop and on the turn, I think that you should bet less than pot when a half pot size bet basically risks the least amount of money to get the information that you're looking for. And this is the opposite of no limit when we talk about people say, I said I hate when people say they bet for information. Well, PLO is a little bit different because the problem with PLO is that people are constantly drawing on the boards and there are constantly scare cards that are coming. So, on the turn, if you check back a scary card on the turn, it's very difficult to come out, and call a river bet, in position. So, I'll give an example that I came up with here. Let's say that you raise with Jack 10, 8, 7 in position, and the flop comes out King Jack 10 with a flush draw. The guy checks, you bet, and he calls. Now the turn is a king. Now what do you do? Well, if you check back, there are a ton of cards that are going to make it really, really difficult for you to call the river. I mean, obviously, any flushing card, straight card, without you filling up, the guy bets, you're catching a bluff. Even if a draw card doesn't complete, now that the top pair is paired, again, it's a bluff catcher. You've got bottom two that have been counterfeit. So what do you do on the turn? Well, I think, and I've seen some videos that say that you can bet half to 70% pot, because if you're playing against sane opponents in that case, when say the top pair pairs, they're not going to continue chasing the draw, and you're actually preventing them from bluffing you on the river. Again, different from no limit where you don't mind checking back the turn and calling a river bluff. But in PLO, the information, it's not anywhere near as complete as it is in no limit because the guy holds 4 cards. So the lack of information and the lack of definition of your opponent's hand is such that you really kind of do need to bet for information. And I hope that makes sense. Same thing, kind of can happen when, you've got aces on let's say the board comes out, Jack 9, 3. You bet with aces, a guy calls, now the turn's a 9. Or the turn pairs the top pair. Well, what do you do now? Again, if you check back on a super dry board, bunch of cards you won't be able to call the river with. Even if the guy comes out and pots the river on a blank, are you going to call? I think that you can, again, bet what you think will get the job done against that particular opponent. So you're actually risking the least to get basically what the result, your result of what you want, which is winning the pot. So the other times when I think that you should bet maybe less than the pot is with your monsters. And you have to balance your ranges, obviously. But let's say that you raise it up with like a 9-9-8-7 hand and the board comes up, 9-5-5 dry. Or even 9-5-5 with a 2 flush. Well, 9-5-5 with the 2 flush is a little bit different because I think 9-5-5 with a 2 flush, even if you pot it, it looks like you're kind of potting an overpair, and a guy might just jam you with a nut flush draw, a 5, some sort of 6, 7, 8 wrap. But if you bet half pot there on a 9-5-5 dry board, I think that you are going to induce a lot of raises. You're going to induce, obviously, obviously a guy with a 5 is going to raise. But I think that betting half pot on dry boards like that sometimes induce people to raise with absolutely nothing. Because, if you're betting pot on a 9-5-5 board, you're kind of announcing that you probably have an overpair. And again, it's difficult for somebody to call, but sometimes people just don't get involved. You've bet pot, so that means that they need to check raise bluff you more because the pot's that much bigger. But if you bet half pot, they're risking less to try to bluff you off of the hand. So that's why when you look at a board like that, when you flop the monster, I think that you can bet less than pot. But definitely, you've got to pay attention to betting patterns. I think that's one of the most important things, because sometimes guys will just pot with their big hands, and then they'll bet less than pot with their hands that you can take them off of. It's pretty transparent. So, use those heads-up displays. If you're playing live, pay attention to the players and pay attention to their betting patterns. Moving along here, I've had a lot of emails about pot limit Omaha 8. People saying, Bart, you've talked about this, but you haven't talked about it. You talked about it earlier in shows, but you haven't talked about it in a while. We want to hear more about pot limit Omaha 8. Well, it's interesting because at Commerce, they've been periodically spreading a dealer's choice mix game where when you have the button, or every so often, whenever it's your turn, you get to choose from a bunch of different games. And we play at pot limit. And the game that I always choose, and if people really have an interest in PLO 8 and want to like introduce it into a home game or something like that, is 5-card PLO 8. Because with 5 cards, it just means that there's so much more of a chance the weaker players make mistakes. A school of thought is to say that you really should be playing tighter. But I don't necessarily buy into that if you can play well post-flop. But in a 5-card PLO, a dry ace deuce really means nothing. You're really looking for backup. 1, 2, 3, 4 king, something like that. Ace, deuce, 3, 4. I mean, hands like that are huge because of the backup. The chance that you're not going to be counterfeit. Just makes those hands, that much stronger. But I actually got involved in a hand where I got 3-quartered, and again in a reverse implied odd situation. I made a critical mistake, which I really was upset with myself. Just because I kind of got caught up in my uncounterfeitability of this hand in 5-card PLO 8, where I got limped around a bunch of ways, and it was 10-20, and I wrapped queen, jack, deuce, 3, 4 on the table and checked. I don't even know the suits. It doesn't matter. And the board came out ace, 6, 7, rainbow. So I've got queen, jack, deuce, 3, 4. There is absolutely no way that I can be counterfeit here. Now, if you've got deuce, 3, 4 in 4-card PLO 8, you actually can get counterfeit if you can actually be counterfeit if it comes like a running too low pair for you. If you had deuce, 3, 4, and you had an ace, 6, 7 board, and the turn was a 4, and the river was a deuce, you would only have a live 3, and the nuts would be a wheel with 3, 5. But with queen, jack, deuce, 3, 4, there's no way I can be counterfeit. I guess if the turn came a deuce, there's no way I can be counterfeit. So I had the absolute nut low. Now, what's my high, though? It's pretty much garbage. I have a gut shot to a 5. And when we were playing 5-card PLO 8, it's, again, much more likely that somebody holds a big hand, more so than 4-card PLO 8. I actually checked, a guy bet, another guy called, and I overcalled, which was actually it went check, one guy bet, everybody folded, and I called. Ace, 6, 7, the turn was a 5, which is actually my gin card. I've got the 3, 4 straight. I've got the bottom end of a straight and uncounterfeitable low. I let out, the guy raised me. We went to war. We got about $2,000 in, and he turned over 8, 9, deuce, 3, something else, some other card. So we had the nut high and the nut low. But the reason why I bring this hand up, again, another example of reverse implied odds. Going for a draw, I hate it. It's no good. And just fundamentally in PLO 8, if you've got a lock on the low, in this case it was uncounterfeitable, with no chance of really any high here, except in this case the 5. And again, in PLO 8 4-card, it would be a little bit different because that would probably be a stronger hand, but with 5 cards, there was just really no reason for me to continue on with the hand. Really no reason. in PLO8 4 card, if there were a couple people in there and you had a bet and a raise and you had, deuce 3 4 king, you wouldn't continue on with the hand either. Yeah, you've got the lock on the low, but why are you putting all your money in pot limit split games? You have to go for scoop pots. It's not like a limit split game where getting 3/4 isn't a big deal. In pot limit Omaha 8, getting 3/4 is a big deal, and that's how you lose or you win all of the money in the game. So go for both sides of the pot. And again, fundamental error on my case. I was actually reading an article about PLO8 where someone wrote that PLO8 is an interesting game in that it is never fundamentally correct to call pot size bets. And what they mean by that is usually you are going to be folding or you're going to be raising. And just because of the nature of the game and because of the nature of going for scoop pots, the point is that you're either drawing to the nuts on both ends when you're going to get your money in, or you're folding. Now, I think that that's correct in a shorter stack scenario, maybe even like 100 big blinds deep, like they play it online. But I think that there's some exceptions, especially if you're playing live and you've got some physical tells against players and betting patterns down, and if you're playing deeper. And I'll give you an example. And again, this is a little quirky because it was 5-card PLO8. But remember, with 5-card PLO8, if you don't have the nuts both ways, you just have to play it more conservative than 4-card PLO8 because there's more combinations out there. So I'd raise it up to 70 with ace, ace, deuce, king 10 with suited ace, double suited with spades and hearts. And a guy in the blind called. Very, very tight player. Doesn't really mess around. The flop came out queen 5-8 with 2 spades. So I've got aces, the nut spade draw, and the nut low draw. He comes out and he bets pot. Now, if I had backup here, if I had ace, ace, deuce, 3, 4, then I would probably just get it in. I would make a raise. It would be huge. Or even, ace, ace, deuce, 3. But in this case, all I have is aces, the nut flush draw, and the nut low draw. And I just thought that my chances of being counterfeit, I think that right now when the guy bets out and he's a tight player, he's representing that he's got a set and the nut low draw. I mean, that's how tight the guy was. You've got to figure out, obviously, who your players are. Sometimes guys who've got, against guys, there were guys in that game that had no clue that they would come out and bet with a set of 5s there. They'd bet a set of 5s with no low draw. But this guy knew exactly what he was doing. So I thought he had a bigger hand than me right off the bat. Plus, possibly the nut low draw. So he bet 150. I called. The turn was a 4. So 6-7 gets in there. I've got the nut low now. With aces, with the nut spade draw. Now he comes out and bets pot again. And now I'm really, really certain that he's got a big hand with the nut low. Because when you're playing against players that know how to play this game, they're not potting with a naked 6-7 here, which comes in on the turn. Because someone, especially in a 5-card PLO8 game, could easily have 6-7 with a low. If I have 6-7 with any low, the guy's going to get 3/4. That's why this game is a defensive game when you play at pot limit. You just have to have you've got to go for monster hands. So he bets pot again, and I call. Now the river is a 4, and this is where the skill comes in this game. So the board was queen 5-8, turns a 4, bets pot I call, river's a 4, now he checks. Now this is a perfect example here what I thought my read was that he had flopped 2 pair with the nut low on the flop, like a queen 8, 8-5, queen 5, and now he's counterfeit. The pot's 1350. He bet 150 on the flop. I called 450 on the turn. I called. Pot's 1350. Now I've got aces up with the nut low. I pot. He calls, and he's got ace, deuce, queen 8, X. And I take 3/4. Now, again, 5-card, a little bit different than 4-card in the sense that the nuts are more often out there. But fundamentally, if you're playing against good players, the point of the story is to be careful because they know what they're doing. They're not throwing out pot-sized bets with the nut high with no nut low. Queen 5-8-4, if someone's got 6-7 with no low, that's a garbage hand. Unless that you were taking an aggressive stance where you knew your opponent didn't have 6-7 and you were just jamming it to try to get him to fold, because you're only going to win half the pot. And if you've got 6-7 there, and there's a couple people in the pot, and you bet out pot, and there's a raise and an all-in, or you bet out pot and a guy shoves against you, you've got to fold a naked 6-7 there. Because you are putting in your entire stack to win a quarter of the pot. And again, it's just kind of definitely, a wacky game. With that, we are going to take a little break, and we will be back right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays. Previously on Big Poker Sundays.
If you want to send money to Vietnam, just send it to the children of Vietnam.
It's no possible way that works. Was it really addressed to the children of Vietnam?
Yeah.
Why didn't you just send it in a bottle? Like a glass bottle, just throw it into the Pacific Ocean and hope that it got there. Make just as much sense.
Good, yeah.
Oh, right here I have this bottle I fill with money. I throw it for the children of Vietnam.
That's how we got the Cobra. It came over in the bottle. Someone threw it in.
Someone threw it back. Thanks, man. We have plenty of these in our country.
For more with Bob and Huff, tune in to Big Poker Sundays every Sunday, only on PokerRoad.com. Cash Plays.
Welcome back, everyone, to Cash Plays. Again, as always, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com. First email here comes from Jacob in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He says, Bart, I haven't heard you talk about bankroll requirements when it comes to PLO. How many buy-ins do you need to have to play in the game long enough to defeat the high variance? Well, that's an interesting question, Jacob, and I thank you for emailing the show. We talked to Brian Townsend about this, and he talked about PLO having about double the variance of No Limit Hold'em. And I heard it mentioned on Deuces Cracked about buy-in requirements, I think in the Mad Potter series, that you really should have basically what is double your no limit buy-in rule. So 40 to 50 buy-ins, 35 to 50 buy-ins, if you're kind of a tighter player, and if you're a high variance player, you might need as much as 70 or 80 buy-ins. That's how high variance the game is. And if you think about the game, it makes sense. You're just never getting it in with the big edge like you are in No Limit. In No Limit, you can get it in just absolutely killing the guy. You can be, 5-1 favorites, 5 to 6 to 1 pre-flop. Okay, that stuff doesn't happen in PLO. After the flop in No Limit, you can have a guy 9 or 10 to 1. You can have him absolutely crushed. In PLO, if you are getting it in against a guy and you've got 65% equity, that is huge. So most of your edge is coming from 50 to 65% equity. So you can understand how swingy the game is. And if you're a guy that, if you're playing online or you have a tendency to tilt, I would absolutely not recommend PLO for you. And even in the select, 5 to 10,000 hands I've played, I might have played 8 tables, maybe, 10 to 15 hours now at a time. You can just, I don't really tilt that much, but you can just see, you look, because it almost PLO gives the appearance that you're way ahead. But after like a session, I'll go back in Omaha Tracker and check my equity in certain hands where it looks like, oh, look, I've got top set and flush draw, and this guy's got a wrap. I had him crushed. Well, he actually had like 30% equity, in the hand. So but you can't calculate that out. In no limit, I can give you, I can tell you off the top of my head in a given situation what the equity is in a hand. In Omaha, it's pretty much a guess. It's a guesstimate. There's just so many combinations. There's no clear-cut way to figure out, unless you run it on a computer, the equity in a hand. So sometimes it looks like you are getting sucked out on when you're getting sucked out on, but it's not like, you're getting one-outed. So that's why you've got to be very, very mentally stable. Thank you for the email, Jacob, and you've got to have some pretty big bankroll requirements. Next email comes from Chris Williams. He says, my question is about adjustment. I've been moving up limits online pretty quickly now, and I'm playing against players who don't play every hand pretty much face up. How do you adjust your thought processes, and mainly how to interpret hand ranges against thinking players trying to do the same to you? Well, thank you for the email, Chris. Chris, if you're playing online, obviously you get to know the regulars. They start to load your poker tracker up. You can see how many hands that you've got on your heads-up display. And I really think it's important, especially in the state of games now where there aren't a ton of fish, that you mix up your lines against guys and you make a note of it. I fast played a set one hand. I led at him and I 3-bet a set. This time I check raised a set. This time I check raised the turn. This time I check raised the turn as a semi bluff. I overshoved the river for value. I overshoved the river for value as a bluff. I check raised the river big for value. All those types of scenarios, I think, against a good thinking player should be in your arsenal, and you should note them down. Because really, against guys, as you continue to move up, fundamentally the game is much, much tougher. I think it's more the good players are picking up certain patterns that maybe the other players that still might be good, but just not as good as they are. And certain lines that they're commonly taking, and a guy that's not capable of changing their lines. So I think that you really just need to make a conscious effort against certain players to almost like make a playbook. Note, I played a hand this way. He played a hand against me this way. And note past history. And also, too, if you can develop this as a skill, note the people that are losing maybe on other tables that you are playing against them. So if you're playing like 8 tables and you see a guy get sucked out in a big pot over on table A, and you're playing against him on table D, well, you've got to realize that he could be tilting. It's a human behind there. He's not going to just be tilting on table A. He's going to be tilting on table D. I hope that helps you out there, Chris. Question from Michael from San Mateo, California. He says, hi, Bart. Wanted to see if you could discuss hand reading strategy. Not necessarily talking about the Hollywood types of tells, of the shaking of the hand or untwisting of Oreos. More so in the lines of what to look for in betting patterns. Well, I do pay attention at the table. I'm not exactly sure what to be looking for. Well, again, I went over it a little bit just a second ago online with statistics and making notes. I'm going to address this question as it comes to live play. Because in live play, especially against older kind of guys that don't play professionally, it's a real common pattern to see a continuation bet on the flop that's big mean that they have top pair plus. Now, what I mean by top pair plus is that's top pair plus in between top pair plus and 2 pair. That's what that means, not top 2 pair. So let's say the board comes out king 8 deuce with a couple clubs. A guy, older gentleman who raised it up pre-flop kind of tight, he bets out big. Okay. Well, he's got probably at least king queen, because he's probably not raising with king jack, at least king queen, ace king, or aces. Now, when I say his range is top pair, good kicker, to bottom 2. What I mean by that is, let's say he raised with ace queen, and the board comes out ace queen 5, gets checked to him. You won't see that same type of big bet because he thinks that his hand is stronger. Now, the funny thing about that is he's never getting away from his hand because his hand is stronger. It's kind of when we talk about like negative equity slow play and stuff like that. But he'll bet a little bit weaker. Same thing if he flops a set of aces or a set of queens. He'll either not bet at all or bet really, really small. He won't come out with that forceful full pot bet. But a full pot bet in a live game from an older guy, again, you really can tag it down to that range of top pair to bottom 2. You know, if it's the type of guy that might raise with like 8-9 suited and the board came out king 8-9, yeah, he's going to throw that big bet out there. But if he raised with king queen and the board came out king queen deuce, I would expect him not to throw that big bet out there. So that's what I think that hand range represents. And now those are the patterns that I've picked up playing in 3 or 4 years, and it's fairly simple. Obviously, nothing's absolute, but I'm telling you that when like I think I'm going to London in a couple weeks. When I go over there, I'm not going to know any of the players. I hear that the games are like 2 or 3 years behind. That's what I'm looking for. So I know when I call with king jack suited and the board comes out king 8 deuce and he makes a full-size pot bet, that I'm no good. But if it comes out king 8 deuce and he makes a little bit of a weakish bet, I think he might have queens or tens or something like that. So I hope that helps you out there, Michael. Last question here comes from Joe Ferraro. He says, Bart, can you take on the question of tipping? I play 2-5 and 5-10 no limit 3 times a week in home games and 2 to 3 times a month at Borgata. I don't play for a living, but I care very much about making money and winning. Can you give your feelings on the subject and any general rules that you go by? Thanks, Joe Ferraro. Well, Joe, I might have made some enemies at my time at the Bike or Commerce, but I really try to keep my tipping to a minimum. And what I mean by that is if I win a big pot, say I win, a $10,000 pot in the 10-20 game, I'll tip the dealer maybe $5, but it never is over that. And everything else is $1 to $2. Maybe if I win a couple thousand, I win $2. Everything else is $1. And I see guys, throw dealers like $10, $20 all the time. And the funny thing is, of course, I see guys tip dealers when they lose too in disgust. They'll just throw money at the dealer. I find that funny. But especially if you're playing at these levels, 5, 10, and 2-5, if you start tipping more than $1 or $2 per pot, and I'm talking about not $2, if you start tipping like more than $1 and then more than $2 in your big pots and maybe an occasional 5 in your monster pots, it becomes very difficult to beat the game. If you tip $2, $3 every single pot you win, and you're winning 3 to 4 pots an hour, well, that's another $12 to $10 to $15 off of your hourly rate. And how much can you possibly beat a 2-5 no limit game? I think some of the best players might be able to beat a game like that for $50, $55 an hour. Now all of a sudden you're taking $15 off of your hourly rate. You're taking, 20 to 30% because you're over tipping. If you're taking the game seriously, then you won't do it. If you're just having fun and it pleases you, then by all means do it. But I'm assuming, Joe, that you're talking about, you asked this question because it's something that's come up in your mind. Problem I see with home games, too, is this, like the same type of thing. You get the pretty dealer, and sometimes in the games I have, they don't even have $1 chips, so it becomes an issue. It really does. Tip the waitress, tip the security guy, tip the door, tip the dealers, which is a lot of times why I avoid some private games unless they're really, really good, because the rake is normally higher, and the tipping that goes on, I feel, is like highway robbery. At least for a guy like me who's a pro. It actually becomes more profitable for me to play in some tougher games at casinos where the collection is lower and the amount of tipping that goes on is such that it doesn't put a serious, dent in my hourly. Now, the funny thing about Commerce is I tip the floormen liberally, where I'm probably giving $10 to $15 in tips per day to the floor and the chip runners, and that is because they help me get into the best games. If you tip them and you get on must-moves lists, they tend to move you quicker. I'm not saying that they skip you over, but it's worth it for me to spend $200 a month in tipping floormen because that tipping is actually a purpose. Now, at the bike, I never tip the floormen because there's never more than 1 or 2 games. I mean, I would tip them sometimes, but I mean, I wouldn't be tipping like I am religiously at the Commerce. But again, that's just kind of the market. I'm greasing their palms, they're helping me out. I think it's by far worth it. At the bike, I started doing a thing where I would tip the chip runner because I'd call ahead of time, get my name on the board. That would be worth $10 or $15 because maybe I didn't have to wait an hour. But in terms of tipping dealers, where it makes no difference, I say keep it to a minimum. That's going to wrap things up for this week's show. I will see you all next week right here on Cash Plays.